It was 12:38 in the afternoon on January 13, 2006, when the call went out to police. A bank robbery in progress. Moments later, cops were racing through San Isidro, a leafy, affluent suburb north of Buenos Aires. When officers arrived at the scene, a tan two-story branch of Banco R, one of Argentina's largest financial institutions, they were pleased to discover that the thieves were still inside. As officers established a perimeter, they watched as the bank's lone security guard ambled out the door, carrying his gun. The robbers had emptied the weapon and placed its bullets in the guard's pocket before permitting him to leave. There were hostages inside, he reported, and 10 minutes later, another of them, a young, nervous man, was released. Shortly after that, a masked thief appeared at the door, clutching a woman. When he caught a glimpse of the assembled police force, the thief let the woman go and he ran back inside the bank. There were 5 thieves in the bank, costumed in various disguises, and now they were trapped, along with 23 hostages. Outside, the streets were swarming with police, who soon established radio contact with one of the robbers, who called himself Walter. The thieves knew they were surrounded, Walter said, but they weren't yet ready to give up. And until they were, the police had better stay back. Nobody wanted to see another Ramello. This struck a nerve. The heist in the town of Ramello was infamous in Argentina. 6 years earlier, 3 armed men had burst into another bank, not far from this one. As on this day, the thieves held hostages and, during an attempted escape, used them as shields. That's when things went sideways. Police opened fire, killing a robber and 2 hostages. Ramello was a national scandal, but what made it especially terrible is that the fiasco played out on live TV. Now, in San Isidro, the news cameras had arrived again, training their lenses on the scene as more than 100 cops surrounded the bank and cordoned the nearby streets. Every available perch that afforded a view to the bank was occupied by either photographers or snipers. For more than 6 hours, the nation was transfixed. The police had nicknamed Walter, the man in the gray suit. He was instantly famous. The hostages, Walter said, were being treated well. The mood inside seemed oddly ebullient. At one point, Walter and another robber could be heard singing, "Happy Birthday," to a bank employee whose phone had been buzzing with birthday messages from friends and family. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Walter asked for pizzas. The hostages were hungry, he said. Then, only a few minutes later, Walter went silent. For over 3 hours, police leaders and city officials fretted over what to do as further attempts to reach Walter failed. Finally, a team of Special Forces officers took up position outside the bank. At 7 p.m., they burst inside. But there was no shootout, no commotion, and no sign of the thieves. The hostages were dispersed on 3 floors, the lobby level, a mezzanine space, and down in a basement conference room, which had been locked from the inside. They were all unharmed. It wasn't until detectives reached the basement that they discovered what the robbers had truly been after. There, in the expanse of the bank's subterranean level, hundreds of reinforced steel safe deposit boxes lined the walls. And in a place like San Isidro, at a time like 2006, those boxes represented a veritable treasure trove. Argentines are uniquely distrustful of their banks, and for good reason. They've been betrayed by them over and over. Most famously in 2001, when the collapse of the national banking system, known as the Corralito, erased entire fortunes, affecting millions. With no faith in accounts, bank customers began tucking their savings, their cash, jewelry, and other valuables into safe deposit boxes. And this particular bank, situated in one of the richest enclaves of Argentina, must have seemed especially enticing. Flush as its deposit boxes were sure to be with the fortunes of the city's most well-to-do. Somehow the thieves had smashed open a huge number of the boxes, 143 of the bank's 400, and cleaned them out. But what exactly they'd grabbed, or where they'd gone, was a mystery. Cops swept every inch of the bank's 3 floors but failed to locate a single member of the gang. The bank had only 2 exits, both of which had been covered by police since the siege began. All of the building's windows were intact. And the robbers were not hiding among the hostages. They'd simply vanished. The thieves had left a few things behind. Detectives found a battery pack, a tool that they surmised had been used to crack the boxes, a row of toy guns laid neatly on the floor, and a note taped to the wall above the toys. It was handwritten and must have seemed like a taunt. In a neighborhood of rich people, without weapons or grudges. It's just money, not love. The Argentines who had sat glued to their televisions that Friday the 13th would spend the next weeks engrossed by the story of the Banco Rio job, and years after enthralled by a saga that provided one unbelievable twist after another. The incident is still as legendary today as it was 14 years ago. Long after its mysteries were untangled, the so-called robbery of the century endures as a modern-day Robin Hood saga, one that immortalized a crew of colorful thieves who set out to become rich and became folk heroes instead. And it all began with Fernando Araujo. Araujo had a crazy idea, and he shared it with his friend Sebastián García Bolster. This was a few years after the botched Ramello heist had lodged itself in Araujo's brain. It would be crazy to rob a bank but not leave, he mentioned to Bolster. To disappear through a hole. Bolster had been friends with Araujo since high school, and he agreed. That did sound like a wild way to rob a bank. But he assumed it was just some lark. His pal Araujo smoked a lot of weed. The two had grown up together in upper-middle-class homes in the north suburbs, but they were very different. Whereas Araujo pursued eccentric, occasionally illegal, interests, Bolster was a law-abiding family man. He worked mostly at repairing small engines, motorcycles and jet skis. But he was also an inveterate tinkerer, the kind of guy who sketches plans for a cheap, home-built helicopter in his spare time. Araujo might have had his friend's mechanical talents in mind when he floated the idea of a bank robbery. But Bolster paid it no mind. Araujo, on the other hand, couldn't get the notion out of his head. He was a free spirit and an artist. He'd gone through a breakup and was now cultivating various strains of high-grade marijuana. He had blacked out the windows of his loft in order to remove the world. He ate sporadically, slept when he felt like it, and taught martial arts to pay his bills. He studied Eastern philosophy and was consumed with bank robberies, watching every possible film, TV show, and documentary he could find, searching for inspiration, and also mistakes, as he set out to architect the perfect heist. He listened to Mozart and Beethoven for creativity, and also Bank Robber by The Clash for motivation. When Araujo came back to Bolster in 2004, it was with more concrete plans. "I need technical things," he told his friend. "You will be my Lucius Fox," Araujo said, referencing the comic book purveyor of Batman's fantastical tools. Bolster was wary. He was disinterested in crime. Plus, he knew that banks were no easy target. He had worked part-time at one, even earning Employee of the Month recognition. But he'd grown to hate financial institutions. His father and grandfather had both lost money in crashes. "I watched my father working all my life, and I saw how the banks stole his money," Bolster thought. "Well, I went to get it back." If Araujo could promise him that the robbery would not involve violence, that they wouldn't even carry weapons, he was in. Araujo's years of contemplation had landed him on an audacious and complicated plan. He would arrive and exit using a tunnel. The suburbs of Buenos Aires were honeycombed with enormous storm tunnels that ran beneath the streets and drained to the river. Araujo figured that all he needed to do was find one that could get him near the bank he had in mind and then dig upward. The idea began to take shape. One obstacle vexed Araujo longer than others. How would he disable the alarm systems that protect the bank when the place is empty? The only viable solution ratcheted up the degree of difficulty. They'd have to go in during a workday, when alarms weren't a factor. And how, Bolster wondered, would they do that? By creating a diversion, Araujo said. He already had a clever one in mind. They could stage a phony bank robbery, a traditional smash and grab. Then, with the entire country focused on that, he'd quietly drain the boxes in the basement. In Bolster, Araujo had his engineer, the guy who'd mastermind the tunnel work. But for a job of this magnitude, he needed a dream team of thieves. Via friends in the city's underworld, he recruited a veteran bank robber whom everyone called Doc, plus an old associate of Doc's named Rubian Alberto de la Torre. Beto and Doc had both been members of a legendary crew of armed thieves known as the Super Banda, which terrorized banks across Argentina in the 1980s and 90s, often engaging in wild daylight shootouts with the police. The pair had mellowed with time, but their violent pasts made Bolster nervous anyway. He decided that the biggest of his jobs, carving the tunnel from the city's storm drains up into the bank, was best done alone. The solitude made it easier for him to compartmentalize the operation as an engineering problem, not a major criminal scheme. For months, Bolster would drive his truck down to Peru Beach at night, parking near the spot where the city's huge drain tunnel emptied into the Rio de la Plata. He'd slip inside around 9:30 and slosh his way through the labyrinthine drain network, hiking for about a half hour to reach the location adjacent to the bank from which his work would commence, located beneath a manhole cover in the street. With a hydraulic shovel, Bolster spent his nights chiseling the hard earth beneath the street, inching ever closer to the bank. He claims that his wife never questioned his nocturnal absence. She just assumed, he says, that he had a mistress. Problems arose and problems were solved. For instance, what is the proper angle for a tunnel that runs from an underground canal to the bank's foundation, many meters above? Misjudge by even a little and you could end up in an old lady's basement. The answer, of course, was just math. Bolster knew he could calculate the precise angle if he had lengths for two sides of a triangle: the vertical distance from the street to the floor of the canal below, and the horizontal distance that the tunnel would travel to reach the exterior wall of the bank. The first measurement was simple to obtain. Araujo rode his bike one night to the bank and found a storm drain through which he fed a string with a weight tied to one end. When it clanged on the canal floor, he had his triangle's height. Calculating the horizontal distance was trickier. But Bolster had an idea. There was that manhole cover in the street, directly above the spot where his tunnel would begin. He'd measure from there to the wall of the Banco Rio, but he knew he couldn't just show up on Calle Peru using a measuring tape to size up a bank without arousing some suspicion. So he measured the circumference of his bike tire and then, late one night, walked his bike from the manhole cover to the wall of the bank as inconspicuously as possible, counting each full rotation by watching the air valve as the tire rolled. It was 37.5 rotations, or about 185 feet. Bolster did the math. The tunnel should be 69 degrees. Would it all be worth the effort? It was tough to guess how much they'd make, but Araujo tried. He says he used the purported take from a 1997 robbery of safe deposit boxes to work up an estimate. In that heist, thieves opened 167 boxes and took a total of $25 million in cash. By that formula, and accounting for some inflation, the 400 boxes in the Banco Rio, Araujo decided, might yield as much as $60 million. To finance what was quickly becoming a costly scheme, Araujo sold his car and plowed about $5,000 into the endeavor. But supply costs ran amok and the money didn't go very far. They needed an investor. And Doc had the perfect man in mind: a renowned Uruguayan thief named Luis Mario Vitet Solanes. Vitet had money, style, and expertise. He was a specialist in exotic entries, having been the famous Spider-Man of Buenos Aires. Back in the 1990s and 2000s, a slimmer Vitet scaled buildings in order to rob apartments. Until he was caught, he had a grand old time frustrating cops while supporting his voracious booze and coke habits. When Araujo reached out, Vitet had been semi-retired from crime. He had a nice home and a comfortable life, but once a thief, always a thief, he says. This was too sweet to pass up. He invested about $100,000 and was immediately helpful as a problem solver. One big chore on Bolster's list was figuring out how to crack into the safe deposit boxes. Easy enough, he figured, if he had one to practice on. So Araujo set out for a neighboring branch of Banco Rio, where he asked to rent a box, made note of the brand, and then bought a few from the manufacturer. Whatever Bolster built had to be fast, powerful, and quiet, so as to not reveal to anyone inside the bank that someone was breaking into boxes. That ruled out explosives. Cutting wouldn't work, either. That would create fumes, which could become dangerous in the confined space of the basement box room. His solution was a jackhammer with ample force to punch through the locks. He built it in a way that ensured it could be transported in pieces, assembled in the bank, and taken apart rapidly. He called it the power cannon. This would get them inside the boxes, but how to get their contents out of the bank? If they contained the kind of cash and valuables that Araujo imagined, there was no way to carry the loot out by hand. Boats would work. Specifically, inflatable zodiacs. But the water level inside the storm canal was rarely deep enough. A raft loaded with men and money would drag on the bottom. No problem, Bolster thought. He'd build a dam to raise the water depth. He designed one in his shop, using wood, then took it apart so it could be installed in the storm canal over several nights. At every turn, Araujo imagined what could go wrong. He began to wonder what would happen if the cops discovered they were escaping through the tunnels beneath the streets. Naturally, he figured, cops would assume that the robbers would exit through the canal's terminus, at the river. But he wanted as much advantage as he could create. A better idea was to flee the other way, by going deeper into the dark, fetid canals. This way, they could pop up anywhere in town. They simply could park a getaway van above a manhole and have a driver waiting patiently while a tense hostage situation occupied the city's entire police force barely a mile away. On the day of the robbery, the 7 men went about their regular morning routines and then prepared for their roles in the big play. Some of the gang members met for coffee at a bar. While there, they applied glue to their fingertips, hoping that when it hardened they wouldn't leave prints. Then they set off in 3 vehicles. A pair of cars stolen that morning headed to the bank while the getaway van, driven by a man named Julian Zalasheveria, cruised to the pickup spot. Bolster, as usual, worked alone. He drove separately to Peru Beach, parked his car, and entered the tunnel around 7 o'clock that morning. First into the bank was Beto, dressed as a doctor, in a baggy lab coat, followed by Doc, who wore a ski mask. Beto pulled out a toy gun he'd taken from his 9-year-old son that morning, flashed it around, and told everyone to get on the floor. This was a robbery. Meanwhile, Vitet in a last-minute addition, a 7th member, known as Luis the Uruguayan, whose true identity is still a mystery, drove one of the stolen cars into a garage under the bank. Vitet and Luis carried the power cannon and some other tools into the bank, shut and locked the garage door, and used the car to barricade it. Then both men joined their friends upstairs, pretending to be part of a frantic robbery that was about to go bad. Araujo hung back outside in one of the stolen cars. He parked alongside the bank and put the flashers on, to create the impression that this was the getaway car. He'd filled the back seat with nail strips and oil cans, knowing that cops would recognize these as the kinds of things a gang fleeing after a robbery might use to slow down pursuit. As the mastermind strode into the bank, he wore a baseball cap and a ski mask pulled tightly over a long blonde wig, plus sunglasses, and he looked so unlike himself that Beto put a toy gun to his head the minute he stepped through the doors. "Beto," Araujo hissed. "It's me." Each man now had a task prescribed by Araujo. Vitet would deal with the cops. Luis and Beto would subdue the hostages. And Doc would go the cleaning room and activate the final man, Bolster. The engineer had been sitting there in the dark, waiting patiently at the terminus of the tunnel he dug, separated from the basement now by just a thin wall. Doc arrived and carefully broke the wall from the inside, trying not to leave debris, and greeted the engineer. The game was on. Upstairs, the gang emptied drawers. Vitet sat atop a counter and stepped into his lead role as Walter the Negotiator, a charming man with a fake mustache, a tailored gray suit, and a yarmulke. It was his job to buy the men in the basement the time they'd need to empty the boxes, luring the police into believing that the standoff they were now engaged in was the result of a botched robbery. As planned, Vitet released the bank's armed guard and told the police negotiator that this was proof that we are good people. He said he was freeing his worst enemy. The actual motivation to free the guard was that Araujo didn't want a single real gun inside the bank, because someone might use it. They released a second and then a third hostage too, as part of Araujo's psychological strategy to convince the police that they were making progress, that they had the upper hand and that time was in their favor. Araujo wanted the cops to think that they had the panicked gang surrounded. He wanted to lull the police into feeling they were in a position of power. "We must look nervous and stupid, like we're losing control," Araujo had told his crew. "Also, people watching at home must have sympathy for us. Some freed hostages should buy goodwill." On the radio with the police negotiator, Vitet emphasized that the robbers wanted to avoid a reprise of the Ramello gunfight. He warned that the members of the gang were armed, a complete lie, and prepared to shoot their way out. But they really didn't want to do that. A peaceful resolution, Vitet said, was in everybody's interest. Finally, when Vitet got the signal from Araujo, he told the police negotiator to order 6 pizzas. Then he put down his radio and told the hostages that the gang needed to step away for a meeting. Anyone who moved, he said, would be killed. Down in the basement, Bolster worked fast. Araujo had given them all 2 hours, and he started his stopwatch the minute Doc punched through the wall to let Bolster in. It took Bolster 20 minutes to assemble the power cannon, but soon he was rapidly opening safe deposit boxes and kept the pace up for the better part of 90 minutes. Before long, the loot was piling up around him. Once things were settled upstairs, Araujo and Doc arrived and began to stuff their haul into bags. Araujo knew they couldn't linger. The stalemate upstairs wouldn't last all day. When it was time to go, Bolster took the tool apart, lowered the pieces to Luis the Uruguayan, now in the tunnel, and cleaned the room. Then he assembled a series of fake bombs he'd created and scrambled back through the hole, followed by Beto and Batet. That left Araujo and Doc to finish up around the basement. One sprayed bleach, hoping to destroy any remnant DNA, while the other grabbed fistfuls of barbershop hair from a bag and tossed them around in order to further stymie investigators. Finally, the two men cleaned all evidence of the wall breach from the room where Bolster had entered, ducked into the tunnel, and moved a heavy cabinet in front of the hole. To anyone who entered, the room would appear to be an empty, untouched storage space. 5 guys piled into the first Zodiac, the one with the engine, and hooked a line to the trailing raft, which held a mountain of bags loaded with loot, plus Araujo, who stood atop it like a conquistador. Not everything went perfectly. The engine wouldn't start, and Bolster was too exhausted to argue with whoever kept yanking the starter, which flooded the motor. Araujo had planned for this too. He handed out paddles. It was about 10 blocks to the passage where they ditched the boats and climbed up a ladder into an elevated side channel that led to the getaway van. The men took turns hoisting up the bags, using a pulley system Bolster installed a few days before. Then he pulled up the ladder, leaving no sign that this channel, of the dozens along the pitch-black canal, had been the escape route. The Zodiacs, abandoned below, just floated off. When the Special Forces team finally stormed the bank, the 7 bandits watched it live on TV while counting cash and eating pizza. Or at least they thought it was live. TV stations covered the operation on a 30-minute delay because they assumed the gang would be watching from inside the bank and didn't want to tip them off that a raid was coming. They figured they would trick the thieves. Welp. A day later, Bolster gathered all the credit cards they had found in the safe deposit boxes and scattered them around various storm drains in the area, all of them far from the actual exit point the gang had used. This evidence forced cops to case the wrong blocks and also created dozens of bogus leads, because every time a stolen card was used by someone who'd found one, the police had to dispatch detectives to open an investigation. Their forces and energy were diluted, Bolster recalls proudly. Our advantage was huge. According to news reports, this mysterious band of thieves, who'd embarrassed Argentine police on national TV, got away with almost $20 million in cash and valuables. The cops had no leads. How it all came undone, how the gang got caught and sent to prison, in a fit of impulsive pique hardly seems appropriate, given the precision and care of the crime. If the men were stunned by their capture, a bigger surprise might have been the trajectory their lives have followed since. One marked by curious opportunity, improbable fame, and perhaps the odd satisfaction that getting nabbed could well have been something of a lucky break. The heist was almost perfect, with every member of the crew getting away completely free. However, freedom for most of the crew would not last long. 5 weeks after the extraordinary heist, the wife of Rubian Alberto de la Torre, Alicia di Tullio, was fed up with her husband. Alicia said she knew Beto was cheating on her with a girlfriend, and she could not take the thought that he might leave her with the new woman. The scorned spouse had only meant to give up Beto to the authorities, but since she had seen most of the other members, Araujo, Bolster, Batet, and Zalasheveria, they all went down with their comrade as well. Alicia later apologized to the other men and asked for their forgiveness. However, the police were never able to identify Doc and Luis the Uruguayan, so the two have eluded law enforcement to this day. When talking with author Josh Dean, Beto swore that he never had any intention of leaving his wife. He also admitted how angry and shocked he was by her actions and said, "I never thought she would do that." And since he's the reason they all were caught, Beto added, "I will always be angry, for the rest of my life." Even though the legendary robbers were ultimately caught, none of them served longer than 5 years in prison. The short sentences were primarily due to the fact that none of them used real weapons, just toy guns, according to El País. After they were convicted as criminals, none of the professional thieves regretted taking part in the heist. In fact, the general feeling was that it was one of the greatest accomplishments of their lives. Out of the members of the crew that served time, Sebastián García Bolster spent the least amount in jail, with only 25 months. The engineer avoided a longer sentence because he was only charged with the crime of assisting the crew in digging the tunnel. Luis Mario Vitet Solanes would have served several more years after his conviction, yet his lawyers were able to reduce his sentence to 4 years. He was then deported back to Uruguay and prohibited from ever returning to Argentina. Prior to the Buenos Aires bank heist, law enforcement only made sure that exits above ground were monitored during a robbery, which included the obvious routes through doors and windows, along with more complicated escapes from rooftops or through walls into adjacent buildings. However, since the crew had used tunnels so effectively, the police were forced to change their strategy from that point on. Sebastián García Bolster explained to author Josh Dean that the officials referred to the implemented procedure as the man in the gray suit protocol. For the new process, the possibility that robbers might be using deception was not only more accepted, it became something to consider for every case going forward. Furthermore, officers were required to access blueprints under the foundation in order to block escapes leading underground, or at least to consider monitoring these routes as well. Yet, in 2011, the adopted protocol seems to have been neglected during another successful tunnel heist in Buenos Aires. This time around, the crew operated when the Banco Provincia branch was closed and set off alarms more than once in the process, says the BBC. However, the police did nothing because the doors to the building were sealed shut. Since Sebastián García Bolster was not involved with the criminal lifestyle beforehand in any way whatsoever and Fernando Araujo's experience was also minimal, they both acknowledged the immorality of their actions to some extent. Bolster even admitted to author Josh Dean that people's reactions to him were a bit strange. The engineer said, "No one has ever said anything bad to me. On the contrary, many people congratulate me. That's very confusing. I know it's wrong to steal, but they congratulate me. To understand this, you have to be Argentine." The getaway driver, Julian Zalacheverria, was previously a career criminal, so he was significantly less conflicted with his actions. But he also did not expect to be treated the way he was after the heist. Years after retiring from his life of crime, Zalacheverria enrolled in law school and was somewhat disturbed when professors approached him for photos or stories about the famous robbery. Approval for the heist did not just come from those who interacted with the former thieves, as many Argentinians were quite vocal about their admiration. Salvador Peluso, an employee of the water sports store near the bank, was among them, and he told the Washington Post, "Everyone I know is talking about it and saying the same thing, that the people who did it are geniuses. They robbed a bank without a single gunshot being fired and got away with everything. It's like a good movie." Now famous after their legendary heist, a few of the crew members separately collaborated with journalists to tell their version of the event. Beto de la Torre spoke with one journalist who wrote, "Without arms or grudges," but after its release, he decided it was not accurate enough and teamed up with a different writer for Robbery of the Century: The Secret History, as reported by GQ. Julian Zalacheverria was the only one convicted who did not want to be involved with any of these books, since Luis Vitet has his own version of the story as well. Fernando Araujo and Sebastián García Bolster were heavily involved in the most ambitious project, a highly fictionalized comedy film called El Robo del Siglo, or The Robbery of the Century, released in 2020. While Bolster consulted and appeared in the movie, Araujo wrote the original script. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.